To all of you, I offer the peace and joy of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Pope John Paul II was not alone as he lay on his deathbed in his Vatican apartment on the last day of his life. Beneath his third-floor windows, where the lights stayed on all through the chilly early spring night, thousands of young pilgrims kept vigil with their beloved Holy Father, praying and singing to communicate their affection to the dying Pope. The loud clanging of a Vatican bell also mourned his death. In the Apostolic Palace, the ritual of recognition and the blessing of his remains took place. Then also, the destruction of his ring and the sealing of his apartments. Then, the burning chamber in the basilica was opened. An estimated 3 million people came to pay him homage. Many leaders came to his funeral. For a few hours, they seemed to put aside any disputes as a tribute to a common friend. His tomb in St. Peter's Basilica is now one of the most visited places by pilgrims. For many, John Paul II is more than a saint. He's a father, a friend, and also an intercessor. And in his last moment, he revealed a meaningful message that shocked the world. A mysterious message left by Pope John Paul II has stirred the curiosity of millions. Was it a prophetic warning about the end of times? The last words before his death. John Paul II's health began to decline 2 months earlier, on the night of February 1, 2005, when he was urgently hospitalized at Gemelli Hospital. He had breathing difficulties, the flu, and a swollen throat. For a few weeks, this hospital in Rome became a pilgrimage destination. Hundreds of people visited just to be near him. John Paul II greeted them often from the 10th floor window of the clinic. At the end of February, they did an emergency tracheotomy. Our Pope couldn't speak, but he did not stop seeing pilgrims. That year, the Pope was unable to attend the Easter ceremonies, and he continued to struggle with the severe illness until he passed away. May our prayerful silence accompany these first moments of the Holy Father John Paul II with Christ in heaven. Pope John Paul II was a man of great spiritual and moral stature, whose influence was felt far beyond the Roman Catholic Church. As he approached his final moments, the words he chose to be left behind were full of mystery and depth, which fueled the curiosity and reflection of millions. These were not just the words of a man who knew his death was near, but a well-thought-out message that contained his life's teachings and his profound link with the divine. Understanding his last message gives a glimpse of the faith that guided him and the legacy he left behind. In the last chapter of his life, Pope John Paul II dealt with serious health problems that limited his physical activities but never his spiritual determination. Even though the pontiff's Parkinson's disease, which was noticed by the public through his slurred speech and shaky movements, was debilitating, he still managed to carry out his duties with great determination. This perseverance in the face of illness revealed his deep commitment to his role and the people who sought his guidance. John Paul II's health problems were more visible in 2005, when flu symptoms and breathing problems resulted in several hospitalizations. These health scares were evidence of a definite decline in his physical condition, which worried his followers across the world. The Vatican's confirmation of his Parkinson's disease made his struggles public, highlighting his vulnerability and humanizing him even more in the eyes of the world. Even though his body was getting weaker, his will to be a spiritual leader did not change. During this period, the Pope decided to stay in the Vatican, which was a clear sign of his wish to spend his last days in the spiritual center of his life's work. His choice was a touching proof of his devotion to his position and the people he served. Although his health was deteriorating, even to the point of a severe septic shock that would finally lead to his demise, John Paul II still kept his pastoral mission. This further proved that his spirit was still strong. His medical report stated the cause of death as septic shock with cardiocirculatory collapse due to an already detected infection of the urinary tract. As the end of the Pope was approaching, tens of thousands of people gathered in St. Peter's Square to hold a vigil in his honor. On April 2, 2005, at approximately 3:30 p.m., he said his last words in his native Polish, "Let me go to the house of the Father." These simple yet profound words summed up his whole life's dedication to his faith and willingness to meet his Creator. Hours later, he fell into a coma and eventually died, thus leaving behind a world that loved him not only as a pope, but also as a symbol of hope and moral strength. In this last message, released after his death, Pope John Paul II stressed the idea of divine mercy, the central theme of his theological doctrines during his role as the Pope. This message was based on the Christian tradition of forgiveness and reconciliation, expressed in the biblical passage where the resurrected Jesus appears to his disciples and shows them his wounds. This event was proof of his resurrection and a deep representation of love and sacrifice, themes that John Paul II emphasized in his last words. His message was the transformative power of God's mercy, which he thought could change hearts, mend divisions, and create peace among peoples and nations. Through the story of doubting Thomas, whom Jesus called to touch his wounds, John Paul II underlined the significance of belief and trust in the face of divine mystery. He used this narrative to inspire a more profound and better understanding of divine mercy. Today I, Jesus, I trust in you. Have mercy on us and the whole world, he said, summing up his plea for divine mercy. He was always in touch with people of different faiths and backgrounds and spread a message of unity and common purpose based on love and compassion. John Paul II's idea of divine mercy was also a call for the whole world to receive this love and show it through acts of kindness, forgiveness, and solidarity. His teachings urged people to go beyond their interests, be just, and be peacemakers in a world full of problems. By his words and actions, Pope John Paul II showed how embracing divine mercy could bring about the most significant changes in personal lives and the wider world, thus creating a spirit of reconciliation and mutual respect. The assassination attempt. Pope John Paul II's encounters with assassination attempts further demonstrated his dedication to peace and reconciliation. On May 13, 1981, in St. Peter's Square, he had a life-threatening moment when Mehmet Ali Agca, a member of the Turkish extremist group Grey Wolves, shot at him with a Browning 9mm semi-automatic pistol. The bullets caused severe injuries, puncturing his colon and small intestine many times. This incident resulted in a quick medical response, and even though he suffered huge blood loss, John Paul II managed to survive after a long surgery. This event was deemed extraordinary, not only due to his survival, but also because of his reaction to it. 2 years after the attempt on his life, John Paul II went to see Agca in prison. This meeting was held in secrecy, creating a very intimate moment of forgiveness. The Pope called Agca a brother and publicly stated that he had pardoned him. This act of forgiveness represented his doctrine, forgiving those who wrong us, a principle deeply rooted in Christian teachings. It was a strong example of compassion and mercy that impressed the whole world and confirmed his position as a peacemaker. This was not the only attempt on his life. However, after each incident, John Paul II's commitment to his mission of peace and reconciliation only got stronger. His readiness to forgive and pursue peace, even with those who had harmed him, proves his character and his strong belief in the Christian doctrine of love and forgiveness. During his papacy, he was a strong proponent of peace, frequently using his power to settle disputes and urging people to talk to each other. The canonization. The canonization of John Paul II on April 27, 2014 was a significant event in the history of the Catholic Church. It was proof of his considerable influence as a spiritual leader and a sign of the deep love and respect he had for millions worldwide. Being aware of his immense contributions to the Church and the world, Pope Francis sped up the canonization process, which normally takes 5 years after a person's death. This action highlighted the unique nature of John Paul II's papacy and his lasting legacy. John Paul II's sainthood was confirmed by the verification of 2 miracles, which were credited to his interference. The first case was the treatment of a French nun with Parkinson's disease, the same disease that John Paul II fought in the last years of his life. The second miracle was about a Costa Rican woman who got cured of a brain aneurysm after she prayed for his intervention. These events, which the Vatican saw as the divine confirmations of his sanctity, emphasized his still ongoing spiritual presence and influence. Besides the miracles, John Paul II's legacy is rich in the tireless advocacy of peace, his philosophical writings, and his efforts to bridge the gaps between the different faith communities. He was famous for his skills of connecting with people on a personal level, say in their native language, during his trips and talking to the young, the suffering, and the marginalized directly. His friendliness and sincere concern for people's well-being made a lasting impression, creating a feeling of kinship and closeness with those he met. The title, John Paul the Great, sometimes used in discussions about him, shows the wide range of his impact. This title is seldom given, showing the significant and lasting changes he brought to the Catholic Church and the global discourses. His teachings and actions were the main reason for the development of Catholic social teaching in the last part of the 20th century, and this influence is still felt in discussions on religion and public life today. The legacy of John Paul II. After St. John Paul II died on April 2, 2005, the huge crowd at his funeral chanted Santo Subito for the well-traveled, much-beloved Pope. Long before Pope Francis earned the nickname, St. John Paul II was known as the People's Pope. St. John Paul II recognized the value of modern travel and mass media in spreading the gospel and a global message of goodwill. He also used his personal visits to reinvigorate local church communities and canonized more saints than any pope in history. During more than a quarter century on the chair of Peter, St. John Paul II also published numerous important documents in the life of the Church. John Paul II dealt lethal blows to many dictatorships. With the exception of communist Cuba, most countries in Latin America today enjoy democracy. Today, Chile is a member of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the Rich Countries Club, while Brazil's middle class has soared by 40% in the past decade. In 1978, however, that was not so. Most countries in the region were ruled by ruthless military dictatorships. In 1987, John Paul II visited Chile, where he made many gestures supporting the pro-democratic opposition and asked the country's dictator, General Augusto Pinochet, to step down. A few months later, Pinochet held a referendum asking the Chilean people if they want a return to civilian rule, which they did. Meanwhile, in 1983, the pontiff visited Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, then ruled by the extravagant dictator, Baby Doc Duvalier. John Paul condemned the poverty and political violence, and shortly thereafter, the Haitians rose up and drove Duvalier out of the country. In addition to Latin America, John Paul II's visit to the Philippines, ruled by dictator Ferdinand Marcos, influenced the local church to lead a successful non-violent revolution against the dictatorship. The late Archbishop of Manila, Cardinal Jaime Sin, the informal leader of the Philippine People Power Revolution, said he was inspired above all by John Paul II and solidarity. The Church's relationship to other religions has changed forever. Before the Second Vatican Council, relations between Catholics and Jews were quite difficult. Until the pontificate of St. John XIII, Catholics prayed for the conversion of the perfidious Jews during the Good Friday liturgy. Today, relations between the Church and the Jews are arguably the best they have been in 2,000 years. St. John Paul II became the first pope to make an official visit to a synagogue, to establish diplomatic relations between the Holy See and Israel, and to condemn anti-Semitism as a sin. Repeatedly during his pontificate, John Paul proved to be a friend of the Jews. When the pontiff died, the Jewish world was in mourning, feeling it had lost a brother and protector. Similarly, he became the first pope to visit a Protestant church. The dignitary who had the most audiences with St. John Paul II was the Dalai Lama. The Polish pope and the Tibetan Buddhist monk both came from ancient nations that experienced communist oppression imposed by their powerful neighbors, and so they seemed to share a special ecumenism of blood. Christian unity, while still a long way off, is closer than ever before. I make an effort to regularly pray for the unity of all Christians, and if you do not, I encourage you to do so as well. God wants unity and not divisions. While the prospects of this actually happening anytime soon seem unlikely, St. John Paul II certainly moved things forward. Earlier this year, Pope Francis traveled to Armenia, the world's oldest Christian nation, where most people belong to the Armenian Apostolic Church. There, he signed an agreement with Catholicos Karekin II, in which the two men agreed to work towards full communion between their respective churches. This would not have been possible without a declaration signed between John Paul II and the previous Catholicos, in which they agreed on a shared definition of Christ's nature, the biggest theological obstacle to full communion between Rome and Echmiadzin, where the headquarters of the Armenian Apostolic Church are located. In the life of Pope John Paul II, we can see a man sent by God, prepared by him, and made bishop and pope to guide God's church. John Paul II brought the gospel to more people than anyone since St. Peter. In all likelihood, St. John Paul II was seen by more people in person than any other figure in world history. He not only traveled widely across Italy and visited almost all of Rome's parishes. In addition to leading the global church, the Pope is also the Bishop of Rome and Primate of Italy. John Paul visited 2/3 of the world's countries. As we saw before, his visits to communist Poland and nations governed by military dictators had enormous political consequences. Difficult political situations were no deterrent to papal travel. For example, John Paul II was the only major head of state to visit East Timor during its brutal occupation by Indonesia. Consequently, many East Timorese men born after the visit are named John Paul. However, John Paul II made a point of not only visiting countries on the peripheries, but of bringing the gospel to rich nations threatened by the cult of Mammon as well. After his native Poland, the nations John Paul II paid the most visits to were France, which over the past 2 centuries had rejected its ancient Christian roots, and the United States. Even nations with tiny Catholic populations like Jamaica and Finland were honored with papal visits. He invented World Youth Day, which is bringing about real rejuvenation where the church needs it most. When Pope John Paul II decided to hold World Youth Day in Denver in 1993, the American bishops begged him to reconsider. Young Americans don't care about their faith, they argued, and the event will be a big public relations flop. How wrong they were. While vocations to the priesthood and religious life in the United States are at a lower level than they were 50 years ago, they have picked up significantly in recent years after reaching a nadir in the mid-1990s, right before World Youth Day was held stateside. Since 1/3 of current American seminarians have cited WID as an influence on their vocation, this correlation cannot be coincidental. World Youth Day in Sydney in 2008 proved to be a similar booster shot to the church in Australia, where vocations and youth engagement in Catholicism are on the rise, while post-Catholic Spain has also seen a growth in vocations since WID 2011 in Madrid. Both Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis have continued to celebrate World Youth Day, and it looks like the event is here to stay. Meanwhile, the Church will continue reaping the good fruits. The papacy became a voice that matters in the world. Encompassing an area of 109 acres, the Holy See is the world's smallest state. Central Park in New York City is almost 8 times bigger. Thanks to St. John Paul II, however, the tiny Vatican microstate has arguably gained the most global influence since the Renaissance. How many divisions has the Pope? Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin once famously said, scoffing at the notion that the Roman priest monarch could have any real impact on the world. John Paul II proved Stalin wrong. From Poland to El Salvador, his travels often had explosive consequences. When John Paul II spoke at the United Nations or at the European Parliament, people listened. He gave a bold example of uncompromising leadership, something rare in our world. The late British journalist and intellectual and Catholic convert, Malcolm Muggeridge, once said that only dead fish swim with the stream. Most political leaders today are dead fish, changing their minds based on what the polling data says. John Paul II, however, was always true to his convictions. He did not care if the op-ed page of The Guardian, La Repubblica, or the New York Times criticized his defense of the unborn, or if Condoleezza Rice was disappointed that the Pope did not back the invasion of Iraq. To the late Pope, the Gospels, and not current trends, were what mattered the most. The final chapter of John Paul II's pontificate, however, was perhaps the most countercultural. Today, we live in an age that glorifies physical beauty and youth, and that is afraid of suffering. Most people want to be like Dorian Gray in Oscar Wilde's famous novel and remain young and beautiful forever. In most Western countries, the vast majority of children with Down syndrome are killed in the womb. There is growing support to legalize euthanasia, not only for the terminally ill, but also for those who simply have become weary of living. On the contrary, John Paul II embraced his suffering and illness from Parkinson's disease and other ailments. His disease and death were very public. This resonated in hearts around the world, judging by the millions who flocked to Rome in the spring of 2005 to attend the biggest funeral in human history. 3 particular traits marked the life of John Paul II: prayer, closeness, and mercy. Despite his many duties as Pope, John Paul II always found time to pray. St. John Paul II was also close to the people, not detached or separated from them, but traveling the whole world to seek them out. Already in the Old Testament, we can see how God was uniquely close to his people. This closeness culminated in the Incarnation, when Jesus himself dwelt among his people. John Paul followed the example of Jesus, the Good Shepherd, drawing near to both the great and the small, to those close by and those physically far away. St. John Paul II was remarkable for his love of justice, but his love for justice was a desire for justice completed by mercy, and so John Paul was also a man of mercy because justice and mercy go together. John Paul, who did so much to promote the Divine Mercy devotion, believed that God's justice had this face of mercy, this attitude of mercy. John Paul II died carrying a heavy cross. He carried it with dignity, but he also carried it according to the principles of Catholic bioethics, refusing disproportionate means when his time to go to the house of the Father had clearly arrived. Remember, John Paul II was a good shepherd to us all, as are all men of Christ. It is up to those remaining to pick up the torch and carry it farther down the road of Christ. A soul in love with God. The fire of God's love, like any big fire, spreads on contact. One tree ignites the next one, and that sets the next ablaze. A tiny spark can set a whole forest alight. That's what a soul in love with God can do, and what Jesus is longing for. But those who want to set the world on fire with the love of God may have to fight many battles. All saints have had to struggle against the resistance of those who hate that fire because they hate the light of the gospel. Saints are strong, they are ready for the spiritual battle. God has made saints out of sinners, but never out of wimps. St. John Paul II, whose feast day we celebrate on October 22nd, is a good example of this. The Nazi occupation forces closed his university, and young Karol had to work in a quarry and in the Solvay chemical factory for 5 years. During that time, aware of his call to the priesthood, he began courses in the clandestine seminary of Krakow. When he became a priest, the communists spied on him. At the age of 60, an assassin shot him and he nearly died. As an old man, he suffered from an intestinal tumor, a femur fracture, and the debilitating Parkinson's disease that rendered him immobile, distorted his physical appearance, and finally took away his ability to speak. It doesn't look like the story of a powerful man. However, he changed the world with the fire of the love of God that he had in his heart. St. John Paul II inspired many countries in Eastern Europe to turn away from communism. His zeal for the gospel took him on apostolic trips all over the world. Neither illnesses, Nazis, communists, nor bullets could stop that flame because it's a divine fire. Saints are not wimps. Mary, Queen of all saints, help us to be strong and reliable so that we can serve your Son to spread this divine fire. During his life and papacy, St. John Paul II often spoke against the problems of secular culture. Many of these exist in our world today, which makes his wisdom on various topics so timeless. The world tells us that love can be confined to a greeting card or box of chocolates, or worse, that love is a fickle feeling rather than a virtuous decision. As Christians, we are called to love beyond a secular standard and to love like Christ, like what St. John Paul II teaches. What really matters in life is that we are loved by Christ and that we love him in return. In comparison to the love of Jesus, everything else is secondary, and without the love of Jesus, everything is useless. In the life of Pope John Paul II, we can see a man sent by God, prepared by him, and made bishop and pope to guide God's church. There are 3 particular traits that mark the life of John Paul II: prayer, closeness, and mercy. Despite his many duties as pope, John Paul II always found time to pray. St. John Paul II was also close to the people, not detached or separated from them, but traveling the whole world to seek them out. Already in the Old Testament, we can see how God was uniquely close to his people. This closeness culminated in the Incarnation, when Jesus himself dwelt among his people. John Paul followed the example of Jesus, the Good Shepherd, drawing near to both the great and the small, to those close by and those physically far away. St. John Paul II was remarkable for his love of justice, but his love for justice was a desire for justice completed by mercy. And so John Paul was also a man of mercy, because justice and mercy go together. John Paul, who did so much to promote the devotion to divine mercy, believed that God's justice had this face of mercy, this attitude of mercy. John Paul II died carrying a heavy cross. He carried it with dignity, but he also carried it according to the principles of Catholic bioethics, refusing disproportionate means when his time to go to the house of the Father had clearly arrived. Remember? John Paul II was a good shepherd to us all, as are all men of Christ. It is up to those remaining to pick up the torch and carry it farther down the road of Christ. The teaching of Pope John Paul II about sickness and death came not only from his speeches, addresses, and encyclicals. He instructed just as convincingly with the witness of his own faith in the face of injury, suffering, hospitalization, illness, and dying. He gave this catechesis for years. He taught us that to understand death with dignity, first accept the dignity of life. Human dignity is an undeserved gift, not an earned status. The dignity of life springs from its source. We come to be by the loving action of God the Creator. What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? You have made him little less than a god, and crown him with glory and honor. The dignity of life is beyond price. We have been ransomed not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ. The dignity of life is clear from our calling. God's plan for human beings is that they should be conformed to the image of His Son. For God created man for incorruption and made him in the image of His own eternity. All who respect their God-given dignity are called to be heralds of a culture of life. Christ's mission was to every human person, and our Lord had a passionate concern for the sick, the suffering, and the dying. In our own time, Christ continues His mission and His preference for the vulnerable through His church. Christ looks mercifully upon us now and at the hour of our death, and the church proclaims solidarity with our brothers and sisters at the end of their earthly journey. The church is a patient advocate, working to ensure proper care for the sick and dying by promoting respect for their dignity. The church is physician and nurse, the Good Samaritan, who treats the wounded and abandoned and never walks by. The church is also the innkeeper who provides the hospital, nursing home, and hospice for care and comfort. Pope John Paul, who was no stranger to sickness and suffering, raised the prophetic voice of the church compassionately, often insisting on the care that is due to the sick and dying. We, Catholics, have prayed for the grace of a happy death. From a sudden and unprovided death, deliver us, O Lord.